Hello everyone from Ukraine. My name is Andriy Drozda, and our guest today is Eliot Akerman. He's an American author and former Marine Corps Special Operations team leader who spent 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then served for 2 years in CIA Special Operations. Eliot Akerman is awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star of Valor, and the Purple Heart. He's also an author of bestsellers Green on Blue, Waiting for Eden, Places and Names on War, Revolution and Returning, and The Fifth Act, America and in Afghanistan. Mr. Ackerman, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thank you for having me.
Okay, so I remember you well visiting Ukraine 7 years ago. Actually, we met then at Lviv Book Forum, and you were reading then from your book Green and Blue, which was translated into Ukrainian a little bit later. It was only the beginning of a war in Ukraine, and no one could imagine how long it would last, and then one day turn in this massive full-scale invasion from Russia. Have you been following the Ukrainian agenda since then? And was the scenario of war against Russia inevitable from your perspective right now?
I most certainly have been following events since then, and as you know, I also work as a journalist. So I have traveled back to Ukraine since we did a few days together in Lviv many years ago. So again, it's good to see you. So do I think that the war with Russia was inevitable? No, I certainly don't think it was inevitable, and it is a tragedy and an incredible miscalculation on part of Vladimir Putin to assume that he could invade Ukraine and that the Ukrainian people would put up the type of substantial resistance that we've seen since February 24th.
Okay, so it was his miscalculation, but in March this year, after the Russian invasion happened, you visited Kiev and spent some 2 weeks there, I guess. For what reasons as a journalist, and why do you decide to go there? What did you see important? What things important? What been impressing you then?
Well, after the invasion, I wanted to return because I'd spent time in Ukraine and wanted to see what was happening for myself. And I think what was so obvious to me then in March was that there was no way the Russians were going to be able to seize Kiev in the face of really stiff Ukrainian resistance, and that they had underestimated what a massive undertaking that would be. Then the question would become, so now what? What would the Russians do? Would they return to Russia? How long will this war go on? And as you alluded to, what new shapes will it take? This war didn't begin in February of 2022. As you know, it began many years before that.
Yeah, it was a very early stage of this invasion, and after that, Russian forces have retreated from the north of Ukraine, from Kiev and Chernihiv regions. Then, after that, they failed to seize Kharkiv, and then lost near Izium and Liman. A lot of things happened since then. Now it looks they are failing near Kherson. A month ago, Putin also started a mobilization campaign in order to replenish his exhausted military forces. Is the Russian army still dangerous, and what they can still achieve in this campaign?
Well, the Russian army is still dangerous, but I think what particularly those of us in the West, in Western Europe and in the United States, I think need to get our minds around is that the Russian army is not invincible. And for too long, we've treated them as though they are invincible. And oftentimes that can create a great strategic liability for us. So I'll only speak of my own country. I believe the United States has been too slow to fully back Ukraine, slow to give them the armaments that they need to bring this war to a decisive solution. And oftentimes that slowness can be a cruelty in and of itself because it prolongs the war. There's a saying, it's a medical saying, that the worst thing you can do is be a gentle surgeon. You don't want your surgeon to be gentle. You want your surgeon, when they cut, to be decisive. So sort of this gradual trickling out of arms and trickling out of support. The danger of that strategy can prolong the war much longer than it should be.
And now, what do you think? American support of Ukraine is still too slow, or are they trying to speed it up?
Well, I think it's been accelerated, but we are, we're seeing that it's taken months to get weapons into the field. Ukraine still lacks the type of air defenses that it needs to counter these Russian missile bullet barrages. Much has been done since February, but more needs to be done so that this war can come to a speedy conclusion. It's dangerous for the West, it's dangerous for Europe to prolong the war. And we see that the longer the war goes on, the more, in many ways, it works to Russia's advantage, because Russia is pursuing a strategy of both energy and economic blackmail against the rest of the world. And the longer that pain endures, it makes it more difficult for Western Europe, the United States, to continue its support of the war. That is sort of what Putin is betting on. So a strategy of only gradual support for Ukraine is in many ways a strategy that works against the objectives of Ukraine, but also the objectives of the NATO nations that are supporting Ukraine.
So what would be the only right decision to make this war come to the end? Give Ukraine more weaponry, artillery, anti-tank, anti-aircraft defense tools, and so on?
Yes, I think to continue the armament of Ukraine, to do so in a very full-throated way. I don't think we're at a point where we should see NATO troops fighting in Ukraine, because that could take the war into, I think, a new phase that would not only worsen the situation for Ukrainians, but worsen the situation for all of NATO countries, and give Putin the type of excuse he needs to galvanize support at home. But being mindful of that. Yes, continued staunch support for Ukraine, so that Russia gets pushed back to the borders before February 24th. And I think that's what needs to be happening now as we sort of finish the autumn and the fall. I think the offensive nature of the war should endure through the winter, and then in the spring, hopefully Ukraine can take back many of the lost territories from February 24th. But that's only going to happen with really decisive support from NATO, to include the United States.
I often hear that Biden's administration and American political elites keep their doctrine, their tactic of managing the escalation with Kremlin, with Russia. So you need to be able to ensure that there is a next step. You have this next step of escalation ahead, and you can just manage the escalation slowly, step by step. Isn't it a rational, logical doctrine and strategy to be used in this situation? Or they really need to help Ukrainians more with weaponry and just give us all the tools for an advantage on the battlefield?
A war like Ukraine is an existential war. It's existential for obviously the existence of the Ukrainian people, and as we're seeing in many ways, it could very quickly become existential for the regime of Vladimir Putin. So wars like that, you don't fight wars like that and manage them. Wars like that are either fought to be won or to be lost, and so the NATO needs to be fighting Ukraine right now to win the war, not to manage the war.
Got it. I often ask this question to my guests from abroad. Why do you think that the Western politicians, military men, and even intelligence underestimated Ukraine before the Russian invasion and said that we are outsiders, underdogs, that like almost a hopeless case that can't win this war?
I think just a lack of understanding of Ukraine. Listen, I don't purport to be a deep expert on all things Ukraine. I'm an American. But as we mentioned, we met in, I think it was 2015 for the first time. Just having visited Ukraine a few times, was very obvious to me was that Ukraine and Ukrainians weren't going to give up their nationhood to Russia. I mean, you spend 5 minutes on the street in Lviv or Kiev, you can see that. It's very obvious. I remember walking into a bar and having to use the restroom, and the toilet paper had photographs of Putin on it. I mean, that gives a very powerful message if you're a Western. So, but too many Westerners just didn't look that way, didn't understand the Ukrainian people, didn't understand the sense of identity that is very, very real amongst Ukrainians, and so figured that Russia, also the Russian military, was this indomitable force as it had been perhaps in the 1970s and 1980s. So they underestimated the performance of the Ukrainians and overestimated the capability of the Russian military, and the result, what we've seen, which is Ukrainian performance and a Russian military that has failed to perform on the battlefield.
And this 8 months of war in Ukraine reveals a lot of new tactical and even strategic approaches to modern warfare. One of them is a massive usage of drones, actually military drones, in a scale never seen before, I guess. Another one is a role of anti-tank weaponry, like javelins, loves, and other ones. How does the war in Ukraine differ from the campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq, from your experience there, actually?
Well, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we were fighting counterinsurgencies. So our adversaries were guerrillas who frequently didn't stand face us in fixed battles, although there were some fixed battles in those wars. The war in Ukraine is very much still a conventional war, but it's a conventional war in which I would say we've seen the ascendance and battlefield, primacy, what I would call anti-platform systems, weapons that are used to destroy a platform like a tank, artillery piece, or even drones are used to destroy much larger platforms. So we've seen an increase in the capability of these anti-platform weapons, and that has in many ways leveled the battlefield. So a state-of-the-art Russian tank doesn't do that well when it comes up against a javelin or an NLAW, and that has advantaged the Ukrainian military that might not have as many tanks, but they do have enough anti-tank weapons. And so we've seen that, and we've seen how that's translated into success on the battlefield.
Yeah, that's the difference. It's a significant one. And let's talk a little bit about the Russian tactics and their doctrine. I will quote your text published in the Atlantic Journal from March this year. Your companion there, who is also a military man, says, "The Russians have no imagination. They would shell our positions, attack in large formations, and then their assaults failed, and then they do it all over again. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians would raid the Russian lines in small groups night after night, wearing them down." How much the lack and even absence of imagination can cause a failure on a battlefield? And why do Russians and Ukrainians show different levels of creativity in war, considering that they both have a similar Soviet heritage, military past?
Well, I think you are very much seeing two different philosophies and style of warfare up against one another. The Ukrainian style of warfare is a much more decentralized style of warfare. It's a style of warfare that is much more recognizable to me as an American military man, in which it's very important on the battlefield that commanders, subordinate commanders, understand their leader's intent. What's the reason for the mission? If you're going to take a hill, why are you taking the hill? So that if conditions on the battlefield change or we lose communication, you still know what your mission is, can act independently. I think what we've seen in the Russian way of war is one that is very hierarchical, very centralized decision-making. So when communications breaks down, no one is empowered to make a decision. And in many respects, we've seen that play out on the battlefield, where smaller groups of Ukrainian soldiers operating under independent commands have been extremely lethal against much larger formations of Russian troops that are incapable of making decentralized decisions. For me, the most visual representation of this was in the war's early days, when the media was reporting at length, as you recall, the 20-mile-long convoy outside of Kiev. And everyone was terrified of the 20-mile-long convoy But what we realized is 20-mile-long convoy was a 20-mile-long traffic jam. It was a visual manifestation of the Russian dysfunction. And there were no 20-mile-long convoys of Ukrainian troops. It's because they had fanned out and were attacking, and weren't waiting for orders to attack. Everybody knew what to do, whereas the Russians did not know what to do. And those are very different psychologies of warfare.
Is there a chance that Russians can learn from that mistakes and significantly change their tactics and their approaches to a warfare right now in a visible days, like very soon?
Well, much of this is cultural. So, I mean, perhaps, but it's very deep in the culture of warfare. I mean, this centralized command structure, I mean, goes back to a very much a Soviet way of thinking. If you look in the Second World War, for instance, in the Second World War, Russian tanks always had two variants. There was a command variant and a troop variant. In the command variant, there was a two-way radio, so you could receive messages and send messages. In the troop variant, there was just a one-way radio, so you could only receive messages from your commanders. You couldn't tell what you were seeing. That psychology, as manifested in the tanks of the Second World War, is one that endures up to this day, where everything comes from the top down, never from the bottom up. And that's a very different philosophy. So could it change? Perhaps, but these are trends that go back over decades of warfighting.
Okay, in September last year, U.S. military forces left Afghanistan. You have written a book about this, The Fifth Act, America's End in Afghanistan. The speed of Taliban seizing the power in Kabul and all around the country after Americans left actually made a big impressions on many people. Don't you think that this picture of America leaving Afghanistan could have pushed Putin closer to invasion into Ukraine? Because for him, it was a clear illustration of American weakness.
Absolutely. I think you can drop a plumb line from President Biden's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, as well as President Trump's. The way that withdrawal was conducted and all the chaos and all the images that we saw around the world of the evacuation from the airport in Kabul, which I would argue is probably one of the darkest chapters in NATO's history, to President Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, because obviously, as he was weighing whether or not to invade Ukraine, one of the variables he was considering was what would the NATO response be. And when he looked in August of 2021 to NATO and its resolve to fight a war and to stay in a war, and he saw the images from Afghanistan, it certainly was encouraging that there would not be a strong NATO response. But we live in very dizzying times, and I would say it's been remarkable to see that 6 months after the fall of Afghanistan, and what I would say again is the darkest chapter in NATO's history, we see one of the brighter portions of NATO's history, which is the way the alliance, I think, really performs in the way that it responds to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's still much work to be done, but the idea that, for instance, the Germans would be openly arming the Ukrainians is something no one would have expected. So the alliance, I think, has overperformed. But you absolutely, I think, can and really must connect the dots between what happened in Afghanistan and Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, because it's a very important reminder for Americans that our actions across the globe matter as it relates to our allies, and that weakness is in and of itself a provocation.
Yeah, there is always a dawn after the darkest night, so after real darkness. So what would, from your perspective, what is the future of the global security system? We now see these great challenges for the security system we have now. Russia, China, Iran, who sell drones to Russia by thousands of those kamikaze drones and so on. Is there a chance that we can keep the security system, to repair it actually, to make it better? Now, what are the chances?
I think something that should be very obvious to anyone who's watching the war in Ukraine is that Ukraine it's a war, but it's also a battlefield in a much broader war that's going on around the world, which is one in which we see the rise of an authoritarian access, nations like Russia, Iran, and China that are challenging the liberal democracies of the world. And so on a global scale, if we say, why does Ukraine matter? Imagine the world if Russia had just gone right through Ukraine with very little resistance, and now suddenly Ukraine was part of Russia. That would probably be a world in which the Chinese were getting ready to, if they hadn't already, made an invasion of Taiwan. And that would probably be a world in which the U.S. and China might be at war. That's a very dark world to be living in. So the fact that Ukraine has stopped Russia has prevented, I think, any type of incursion in Taiwan, or at least dampen the enthusiasm that the Chinese might have had. But it shows, again, how Ukraine matters and how right now the world is very much locked in a broader struggle between a rising authoritarian access and really the Western liberal world order as it exists since the Second World War.
I have two more questions. One is a specific military question, and the second one is about the political support of Ukraine in the United States. So let us start from the military one. You all already mentioned about the different philosophy of Ukrainian and Russian army, about decentralization in Ukrainian army, and I want to ask you about the role of the officers and sergeants in military forces. You left the Marines as a captain. What do you think about the qualities of Ukrainian middle rank officers and also sergeants? What qualities are important for them to provide a decisive advantage on the battlefield?
I think the single greatest quality of officers and non-commissioned officers, sergeants, is initiative. The idea of making decentralized decisions, to understand what the mission is, and then to be able to make independent decisions that will help accomplish the mission in the absence of orders. Because war is always incredibly chaotic. You hope that you'll receive clear orders as to what your commanders want you to do, but oftentimes those orders might not come, or the situation will change very, very quickly. So you need junior officers, and you need non-commissioned officers and sergeants who are able to react very quickly to changing battlefield conditions and act decisively. And in order to create that type of leadership, the military has to have a culture that nurtures it. And my experience in the U.S. military and in the Marine Corps was every part of the culture was about nurturing that type of aggression and that type of initiative in commanders. And I see that as well in Ukraine, and I know that the U.S. military and NATO allies have worked very closely with the Ukrainian military over many years. It seems that work has paid off, and the military has, by any measure, overperformed anybody's expectation.
Good to hear that. And right now, the USA stands on the doorstep of the midterm elections to Congress. If Republicans won, would America still strongly support Ukraine on our way to victory?
I certainly hope so. I think that fortunately, the margins will probably be small enough in Congress that no matter who wins, it won't be enough to completely undermine U.S. support for Ukraine. But I think it's important that America's leaders continue to remind the American people about why this war matters and how high the stakes are, because a loss in Ukraine is, quite frankly, not an option. And the Ukrainian people and the American people against an adversary in Russia that is counting on our resolve faltering. And that is their pathway to victory. Our resolve stays strong if we stay focused on the end state, which is a free and prosperous Ukraine, which will be a beacon for the rest of the world. Then I don't think there is any way that Russia can win this war in the long term. But it all depends on international resolve, and obviously the resolve of the Ukrainian people who are bearing the brunt of this war.
Eliot, thank you so much. It was an amazing experience for me. I'm so happy to see you once again after all these years, and thank you for finding time and joining us today. It was great.
Great. Thank you for having me, and I hope to see you in Lviv soon.
You are always welcomed in Ukraine. We'll be in touch. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you, our dear audience. It was Eliot Akerman, our guest today, and we hope to see you soon with our new guest.